In the small, sleepy town of Willow Creek, life was simple and predictable. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, the town had a charm that attracted few visitors but kept its residents deeply rooted in tradition. Everyone knew everyone else, and while some saw this as a blessing, others felt trapped by the unspoken rules and long-held prejudices that lingered beneath the surface. Miss Eleanor Hayes lived quietly on the edge of town, her modest home surrounded by wildflowers she tended to with care. At 76 years old, she had spent most of her life in Willow Creek, watching generations come and go. She was known for her kindness, often sharing homemade pies with neighbors or offering advice to those who sought it. But despite her gentle nature, not everyone treated her with respect. Some people barely acknowledged her presence, their actions reflecting the quiet racism that still simmered in corners of the community. On the other side of town lived 4 teenagers: Jake, Tyler, Chloe, and Madison. They were inseparable, always looking for ways to entertain themselves in a place where excitement was hard to find. Jake was the bold one, always coming up with risky ideas. Tyler followed along, eager to prove himself. Chloe, though quieter than the boys, enjoyed being part of the group, while Madison often played the role of the peacemaker when things got out of hand. One summer evening, the air thick with humidity, the teens decided to explore the woods outside of town. Rumors had been circulating about hidden treasures buried there, left behind by settlers centuries ago. Armed with flashlights and shovels, they set off into the forest, laughing and joking as they went. The darkness seemed alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, but none of it dampened their spirits. As they wandered deeper into the woods, they stumbled upon something unexpected. Near the tree line, just steps away from the forest, they saw Miss Eleanor. She was kneeling by a patch of plants, carefully plucking herbs and placing them into a woven basket. Her movements were slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the chaos the teens brought with them. For a moment, they stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Then Jake smirked, breaking the silence. "Look who we got here," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What are you doing out here, old lady? Cooking up some magic spells?" Miss Eleanor didn't respond right away. She straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands before turning to face them. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that made even Madison uneasy. "I'm collecting herbs," she said simply, her tone steady. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish before it gets too dark." But the teenagers weren't ready to leave. Jake stepped closer, his grin widening. "Herbs? Really? What are you gonna do with those?" "Make a potion to turn us all into frogs." The others laughed nervously, though Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing a line. Still, she stayed silent, not wanting to ruin the moment. Miss Eleanor sighed, shaking her head slightly. "You children should go home," she said firmly. "This isn't a game." Instead of listening, the teens only grew bolder. Their laughter echoed through the trees as they closed in around her, their playful teasing growing louder and more aggressive. It was clear now that this encounter wouldn't end peacefully. Little did anyone know, the events of that night would change Willow Creek and the lives of everyone involved. Forever. The teenagers' teasing quickly escalated from harmless jokes to something far more sinister. Miss Eleanor, calm at first, tried to ignore their taunts and continued gathering herbs. But Jake, emboldened by the group's laughter, wasn't satisfied with just mocking her. He stepped even closer, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he circled her like a predator. "What's in the basket, huh?" Jake asked, snatching it from her hands before she could react. The herbs spilled onto the ground, scattering across the dirt. Miss Eleanor reached out instinctively, trying to save what she could, but Tyler blocked her path, laughing as if it were all some elaborate game. "Leave me alone," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "You don't want to do this." But the teens weren't listening anymore. Their initial curiosity had transformed into something darker, a mix of boredom arrogance, and an unspoken belief that they were untouchable. Chloe hesitated for a moment, watching as Miss Eleanor knelt to pick up the scattered herbs. Something about the older woman's quiet dignity made her feel uneasy, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she stayed quiet, letting the others take the lead. It was Jake who noticed the shallow hole nearby, a natural dip in the earth, partially covered by leaves and loose soil. His eyes lit up with an idea that sent chills down Madison's spine. "Hey, check this out," he said, nudging Tyler. "Think we can scare her a little?" Tyler grinned, catching on immediately. "Yeah, let's see how brave she really is." Miss Eleanor must have sensed the shift in their tone, because she stopped moving and looked up at them, her expression unreadable. "I've done nothing to you," she said softly, almost pleadingly. "Please, just go home." But her words only fueled their reckless behavior. Jake grabbed her arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to make her stumble, and guided her toward the hole. Miss Eleanor resisted at first, planting her feet firmly on the ground, but the combined force of 4 teenagers overwhelmed her frail body. Before she could fully comprehend what was happening, they pushed her into the shallow depression. At first, it seemed like another cruel joke. They laughed nervously, tossing handfuls of dirt onto her legs. Miss Eleanor sat there, stunned, staring up at them with wide eyes. She didn't scream or cry. Instead, she spoke quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't funny. Let me out." But the teens didn't stop. Encouraged by each other's laughter, they began shoveling dirt over her in earnest. What started as a prank turned deadly serious within moments. The realization hit them suddenly. This wasn't just bullying anymore. They were burying a person alive. Chloe froze mid-motion, the shovel slipping from her grasp. "Wait, we need to stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of dirt hitting the ground. But no one listened. Jake kept going, his face pale but determined. Tyler followed suit, unwilling to back down now. Madison dropped to her knees, covering her mouth with both hands as tears welled up in her eyes. "We're killing her," she choked out, but her words fell on deaf ears. Panic surged through the group, but none of them had the courage to undo what they'd already done. By the time they realized the gravity of their actions, it was too late. Miss Eleanor's muffled voice grew weaker, her struggles less frantic. Finally, silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the heavy breathing of the 4 teenagers. They stared at the mound of dirt, their hearts pounding in their chests. No one spoke. No one moved. We should leave," Jake muttered eventually, his voice shaking. Just go. Now." Without another word, the group turned and fled, leaving behind the horrifying evidence of their crime. As they disappeared into the woods, guilt settled over them like a suffocating fog. None of them dared to look back, but deep down, they knew they'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And somewhere beneath the cold, packed earth, Miss Eleanor's silent plea lingered, waiting to rise again. The days that followed were a blur of guilt, paranoia, and sleepless nights for the 4 teenagers. At first, they tried to act normal, convincing themselves that no one would ever find out what had happened in the woods. But the weight of their secret pressed down on them like a storm cloud, casting long shadows over everything they did. Jake, who had always been the ringleader, seemed determined to pretend nothing was wrong. He laughed louder than usual at school, cracked jokes with his friends, and even flirted with girls as if it were any other week. But those closest to him noticed something off, a twitch in his smile, a flicker of unease in his eyes whenever someone mentioned the woods or brought up Miss Eleanor's name. Deep down, Jake knew he couldn't outrun the truth forever, but he clung to denial like a lifeline. Tyler, on the other hand, became restless. He paced his room late at night, replaying the events over and over in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Miss Eleanor's face, the way she had looked up at them, her eyes filled with fear and disbelief. During the day, he snapped at anyone who dared to ask how he was doing, masking his inner turmoil with anger. His parents chalked it up to teenage mood swings, but Tyler knew better. The guilt was eating him alive, and there was no escape. Chloe was hit hardest by what they had done. She barely ate, spending hours staring out her bedroom window as if waiting for some sign of redemption. Her dreams were haunted by flashes of that night, the sound of dirt hitting the ground, Miss Eleanor's muffled voice growing weaker, and the sight of her friends walking away without looking back. One morning, her mother found her sitting on the floor, clutching a blanket and crying silently. "What's wrong?" her mom asked, but Chloe just shook her head. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? Madison withdrew completely. Once the most outgoing of the group, she now avoided everyone, skipping social gatherings and keeping her distance even from her own friends. When her older brother teased her about being antisocial, she snapped, yelling at him to leave her alone. It wasn't just guilt that consumed her, it was shame. She hated herself for staying silent while the others buried Miss Eleanor. She hated that she hadn't stopped them, hadn't screamed for help, hadn't done anything. The memory of her cowardice gnawed at her constantly. Meanwhile, life in Willow Creek carried on as usual, or so it seemed. Most people didn't notice Miss Eleanor's absence right away. After all, she kept to herself and rarely ventured into town. But Mrs. Thompson, her elderly neighbor, grew suspicious when Miss Eleanor missed their weekly Bible study for the first time in years. She knocked on her door several times, calling out her name, but received no answer. Concerned, she called the local sheriff to report her missing. As news of Miss Eleanor's disappearance spread, whispers began circulating around town. Some speculated that she might have gone to visit family. Others wondered if she'd fallen ill and wandered off. No one suspected foul play, at least not yet, but the teenagers' behavior didn't go unnoticed. Detectives visited their homes, asking routine questions about whether they'd seen or spoken to Miss Eleanor recently. Each teen answered carefully, sticking to their rehearsed story. But cracks began to show almost immediately. Chloe, overwhelmed by nerves, stumbled over her words during questioning. She claimed she hadn't left the house that night, only to later mention seeing some kids messing around in the woods. The contradiction caught the detective's attention, and though Chloe quickly tried to backtrack, the damage was done. Suspicion began to creep in, tightening its grip on the group. At school, the tension between them was palpable. They avoided eye contact in the hallways, skipped lunch together, and stopped texting entirely. Their once unbreakable bond was shattered, replaced by mistrust and fear. Jake accused Chloe of being weak, warning her not to crack under pressure. Tyler lashed out at Madison, blaming her for acting weird and drawing attention to them. Chloe begged them to come clean, insisting they'd feel better if they confessed, but Jake shut her down every time. "You think telling the truth is gonna fix this?" he hissed one afternoon after school, pulling her aside behind the bleachers. "We'll be ruined. Our lives will be over. But we can't keep living like this." Chloe shot back, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you see? We're already ruined." Her word hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. For the first time, they all realized the truth. No matter how hard they tried to bury their guilt, it would always rise to the surface. And somewhere out there, justice was waiting to catch up with them. The discovery of Miss Eleanor's body came on a crisp, overcast morning that seemed to mirror the somber mood settling over Willow Creek. A local hunter named Mr. Grayson had been tracking deer near the edge of the woods when he stumbled upon something unusual, a patch of freshly disturbed earth amidst the trees. At first glance, it looked like an animal might have dug there, but as he knelt down for a closer look, his blood ran cold. Protruding from the soil were frail, dirt-caked fingers, frozen in a desperate attempt to claw free. Mr. Grayson immediately called the authorities, and within hours, the quiet town was swarmed with police cars, forensic teams, and curious onlookers. Word spread quickly, and soon, residents gathered at the edge of the forest, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. Miss Eleanor Hayes, kind, gentle Miss Eleanor, had been found buried alive. The news hit like a thunderclap, shattering the illusion of safety and peace that Willow Creek had clung to for so long. Detectives worked tirelessly to piece together what had happened. They examined the scene meticulously, collecting evidence from the surrounding area. Footprints left in the soft soil caught their attention almost immediately. Some were small and light, likely belonging to Miss Eleanor herself, while others were larger and deeper, clear signs of multiple people having been present. Soil samples were taken, and nearby tools, including a discarded shovel, were bagged as potential clues. Back in town, investigators began interviewing residents, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual in the days leading up to Miss Eleanor's disappearance. Most responses were vague or unhelpful, but Mrs. Thompson, Miss Eleanor's neighbor, provided a key detail. She went out to gather herbs, she told detectives, her voice trembling. She did that often, especially near the woods. I never thought anything of it before, but now. This information gave the investigation a new direction. Detectives revisited the teenagers, whose earlier statements about their whereabouts had already raised suspicions. When questioned again, Chloe's nervousness became impossible to ignore. Her inconsistent answers about seeing some kids in the woods contradicted her previous claims of staying home. Detectives pressed her gently but firmly, sensing they were onto something. Meanwhile, tensions among the group reached a breaking point. Jake grew increasingly agitated, snapping at Tyler and Madison whenever they suggested laying low. "They're not gonna figure it out," he insisted, pacing back and forth in his room. "We just need to stick to the story." But sticking to the story was easier said than done. During another round of questioning, Tyler accidentally revealed that he'd been in the woods that night, a detail he hadn't mentioned before. When confronted, he stammered, claiming he'd simply gone for a walk and hadn't seen anyone else. The inconsistency only deepened the detective's suspicions. As the investigation progressed, forensic evidence began painting a clearer picture. Soil samples taken from the teen's shoes matched the composition of the earth where Miss Eleanor was buried. Tire tracks found near the site corresponded to vehicles owned by their families. Even the shovel bore traces of fingerprints, which detectives carefully lifted for analysis. Each new clue tightened the net around the four teenagers, leaving them with nowhere to hide. The final blow came when Chloe, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, broke down during yet another interview. Sitting across from the kind but persistent detective, she covered her face with her hands and sobbed uncontrollably. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she choked out. "It was supposed to be a joke. We didn't think." Her confession opened the floodgates. Detectives listened intently as she recounted the events of that night. The teasing, the hole, the dirt, and the horrifying realization that they had gone too far. Though her words were fragmented and disjointed, they painted a damning portrait of recklessness and cruelty. News of the arrests sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. Parents defended their children, insisting they were good kids who made a terrible mistake, while others demanded justice for Miss Eleanor. Vigils were held in her honor, with candles flickering against the darkening sky as neighbors mourned the loss of a woman many hadn't truly appreciated until it was too late. For the four teenagers, life as they knew it came crashing down. Handcuffed and led away in front of prying eyes, they faced a future filled with consequences none of them could have imagined. And though the town would eventually move on, the memory of Miss Eleanor and the tragedy that unfolded in the woods would linger forever, a haunting reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control. The trial that followed was unlike anything Willow Creek had ever seen. What had once been a quiet, unassuming town became the center of national attention overnight. Reporters from across the country descended on the small community, setting up cameras and microphones outside the courthouse. The story of four teenagers accused of burying an elderly woman alive captivated audiences, sparking debates about accountability, morality, and the darker corners of human nature. Inside the courtroom, tensions ran high. The teens, Jake, Tyler, Chloe, and Madison, sat at the defendant's table, their youthful faces pale and drawn. Gone were the carefree smiles and confident postures they'd once carried. In their place were hollow expressions, eyes darting nervously between the judge, the jury, and the crowd gathered to witness their reckoning. Chloe was the first to take the stand. Her hands trembled as she swore to tell the truth, and her voice wavered as she recounted the events of that fateful night. She described how the prank had started innocently enough, but quickly spiraled out of control. "We didn't mean for it to go that far," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It was supposed to be a joke. We thought she'd get mad and leave. But then it wasn't funny anymore." Her testimony painted her as remorseful, even sympathetic, a scared teenager caught in a moment of poor judgment. But not everyone bought it. Prosecutors grilled her relentlessly, pointing out inconsistencies in her story and challenging her claims of innocence. "If you realized things had gone too far, why didn't you stop?" one prosecutor asked sharply. Chloe hesitated, unable to answer, her silence speaking volumes. Next came Tyler, whose testimony veered wildly between defiance and regret. He admitted to helping shovel dirt over Miss Eleanor, but insisted he hadn't understood the severity of their actions until it was too late. "I thought someone else would step in," he muttered, avoiding eye contact with the judge. His words rang hollow, especially when prosecutors presented evidence showing that he'd laughed and joked during the act, treating it like some twisted game. Madison's turn on the stand was perhaps the most heartbreaking. Soft-spoken and visibly shaken, she struggled to articulate her role in the tragedy. "I should have stopped them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I froze. I just stood there and let it happen." Her admission brought gasps from the gallery, and even the hardened prosecutors seemed momentarily moved by her raw vulnerability. Finally, Jake took the stand. Unlike the others, he showed little emotion, his demeanor almost defiant. He stuck to the narrative that it had all been a harmless prank gone wrong, refusing to accept full responsibility for his actions. "We weren't trying to hurt her," he insisted, his tone flat and unconvincing. "Things just got out of hand." Throughout the trial, Miss Eleanor's family and friends sat stoically in the front row, their grief palpable. Mrs. Thompson, her lifelong neighbor, delivered a victim impact statement that left the entire courtroom in tears. "Eleanor was a kind soul who never harmed anyone," she said, her voice breaking. "She deserved better than this. We all deserve better than this." As closing arguments began, the prosecution emphasized the irreversibility of the teen's actions. "This wasn't a mistake, it was a choice," the lead prosecutor declared, his voice steady and resolute. "They chose cruelty over compassion, hatred over humanity. And now, they must face the consequences." The defense, meanwhile, argued for leniency, citing the defendants' ages and lack of prior criminal history. "These are children who made a horrific error in judgment," one lawyer pleaded. "They need guidance, not punishment." After days of deliberation, the verdict arrived. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced each teenager to varying terms in juvenile detention, emphasizing rehabilitation over retribution. While some felt justice had been served, others believed the punishment was too light given the gravity of the crime. The divide in opinions reflected the broader societal debate ignited by the case. How do you hold young people accountable without destroying their futures? For Willow Creek, the trial marked a turning point. Conversations about race, privilege, and accountability dominated dinner tables and town meetings. Statues honoring Confederate figures were removed, and diversity workshops became mandatory in schools. Yet beneath these changes lingered an uncomfortable truth. The scars of that night would never fully heal for the town, for Miss Eleanor's loved ones, or for the teenagers themselves. The years that followed the trial brought changes to Willow Creek, but none of them could erase the shadow cast by that fateful night. For the four teenagers, life became a series of consequences they had never imagined when they first set foot in the woods. Each of them carried the weight of their actions differently, and their paths diverged in ways no one could have predicted. Jake, once the ringleader, found reintegrating into society particularly difficult. After serving his sentence, he returned to Willow Creek hoping to rebuild his life, but the townspeople weren't ready to forgive or forget. Everywhere he went, people whispered behind his back, their stares heavy with judgment. Some refused to serve him at local businesses. Others crossed the street to avoid walking past him. The isolation gnawed at him, leaving him bitter and angry. He tried finding work, but employers hesitated to hire someone with his record. Eventually, he left town altogether, moving to a bigger city where no one knew his name. Yet even there, Miss Eleanor's face haunted him, in dreams, in reflections, in moments of quiet solitude. No matter how far he ran, guilt was always one step behind. Tyler's struggles took a darker turn. Unable to cope with the memories of what he'd done, he turned to alcohol and drugs as a way to numb the pain. At first, it seemed like an escape, a way to silence the voice inside him that screamed *monster* every time he closed his eyes. But substance abuse only made things worse. His health deteriorated, and his relationships crumbled. Friends stopped calling, family members distanced themselves, and he ended up living in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. On bad nights, he would sit alone in the dark, clutching a bottle and staring at old photos of happier times. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he would mutter to himself, though deep down, he knew apologies couldn't undo the past. Chloe, however, chose a different path, one of redemption. Consumed by guilt, she dedicated herself to making amends for her role in Miss Eleanor's death. While still under supervision after her release, she began volunteering at community centers, mentoring troubled youth and speaking openly about the dangers of bullying and prejudice. Her honesty resonated with many, especially younger generations who saw her as proof that change was possible. Over time, Chloe earned a degree in social work and started advocating for reform in juvenile justice systems, determined to help other teens avoid the mistakes she had made. Though forgiveness from others came slowly, if at all, she found peace in knowing she was trying to make a difference. Madison, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. She rarely spoke about what happened, retreating into a life of quiet reflection. Rumors circulated that she had joined a convent, seeking solace in prayer and service, though no one could confirm this. Those who did see her occasionally noticed a profound sadness in her eyes, as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. She avoided public events and kept to herself, seemingly content to live a life of anonymity. To some, her disappearance felt like cowardice. To others, it was a sign of regret too deep for words. Back in Willow Creek, the tragedy forced long overdue conversations about race and privilege. Town meetings became forums for discussing systemic issues that had long gone unaddressed. Activists visited schools to teach students about empathy and accountability, while community leaders worked to dismantle symbols of division. Statues honoring Confederate figures were removed, replaced by monuments celebrating unity and resilience. Diversity workshops became mandatory not just for students but also for adults, challenging everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their neighbors. Yet despite these efforts, tensions remained. Some residents argued that focusing on the teens' rehabilitation undermined justice for Miss Eleanor, while others believed punishing them further wouldn't bring her back. These debates continued to simmer, a reminder that healing takes time, and sometimes leaves scars that never fully fade. For Willow Creek, the story of Miss Eleanor Hayes became both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for growth. It exposed the cracks in the foundation of a town that prided itself on tradition, forcing its people to reckon with the ugliness hidden beneath the surface. And though life moved forward, the memory of that summer lingered, a sobering reminder of the fragility of humanity and the enduring power of choices, good or bad. Decades passed, and Willow Creek transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The once sleepy town grew into a more modern community, its streets lined with new businesses and its schools buzzing with fresh ideas. Yet the shadow of that tragic summer lingered, woven into the fabric of the town's history like an indelible stain. For some, it was a story told in hushed tones to warn younger generations about the dangers of cruelty and prejudice. For others, it remained a painful reminder of wounds that never fully healed. It was during this time, a full 30 years after the tragedy, that a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Bennett arrived in Willow Creek. Known for tackling difficult subjects with sensitivity and depth, Sarah had heard whispers of the case while researching small-town America. Intrigued by its complexity, she decided to revisit the events of that fateful night, hoping to shed light on how such a horrific act could happen, and what lessons could be learned from it. The surviving teenagers, now middle-aged adults, agreed to participate in the project, though their reasons varied. Jake, living in self-imposed exile in a distant city, saw the documentary as an opportunity to clear his name, or at least reshape his legacy. He insisted he'd served his time and wanted people to see him as more than just the guy who buried someone alive. Tyler, still battling personal demons, reluctantly signed on, believing it might finally bring him closure, or at least force him to confront the truth he'd spent decades running from. Chloe viewed the film as another chance to advocate for change, hoping her story could inspire others to break cycles of hate and ignorance. Madison, ever private, initially refused, but eventually relented, moved by Sarah's promise to handle her involvement with care. Filming took place over several months, with Sarah guiding each participant through raw and emotional interviews. They revisited the site where Miss Eleanor had been buried, now marked by a peaceful memorial garden filled with wildflowers and a plaque bearing her name. Standing there, surrounded by the beauty that had replaced the horror, they were forced to face the weight of their actions. For Chloe, the experience was cathartic. She knelt beside the plaque, tracing the engraved letters of Miss Eleanor's name with trembling fingers. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I wish I could take it all back." Jake, standing nearby, crossed his arms tightly, his expression unreadable. When Sarah asked him how he felt, he hesitated before responding. "I've thought about that night every single day since it happened," he admitted. "But no matter what I do, I can't undo it. All I can hope for is, maybe someday, people will see I'm not the same person I was then." Tyler broke down entirely, collapsing onto a bench as memories overwhelmed him. "We killed her," he choked out, his voice cracking. "We took her life because we thought it was funny. How do you live with that?" Madison stayed silent for most of the visit, her gaze fixed on the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. When pressed to speak, she simply said, "Some things can't be forgiven, and maybe they shouldn't be." As the documentary neared completion, Sarah invited the participants to watch an early cut together. Sitting in a small screening room, they watched their younger selves, reckless, cruel, and tragically human, play out the events leading up to Miss Eleanor's death. The air was thick with tension, punctuated only by occasional sniffles or sighs. When the credits rolled, no one spoke right away. Finally, Chloe turned to the group, her eyes red but resolute. "We owe it to her," she said softly, "to tell the truth, to make sure this doesn't happen again." Whether the documentary brought redemption or merely exposed old scars depended on whom you asked. But one thing was certain: Miss Eleanor Hayes' memory endured, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience, justice, and the enduring power of truth. And for the 4 individuals who had wronged her, sharing their stories became a step toward reckoning with the past and perhaps finding a way to move forward. The release of Sarah Bennett's documentary sent ripples far beyond Willow Creek, sparking conversations across the nation about accountability, forgiveness, and the lasting impact of youthful mistakes. Titled Beneath the Surface, a story of tragedy and truth, the film was both praised and criticized for its unflinching look at one of the darkest chapters in the town's history. For some viewers, it was a powerful reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and redemption. For others, it raised difficult questions about whether justice had truly been served. The 4 former teenagers, now adults burdened by decades of regret, found themselves thrust back into the spotlight they had long tried to escape. Jake, ever defiant, gave interviews defending his decision to participate in the project. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he told reporters, "but I want people to understand that we were kids who made a terrible mistake. We've paid our dues, and now it's time to focus on what really matters. Learning from this so no one else has to suffer like Miss Eleanor did." Chloe became the face of hope amidst tragedy. Her advocacy work gained renewed attention after the documentary aired, with schools and organizations inviting her to speak about overcoming guilt and using pain as a catalyst for positive change. She often brought along copies of the memorial plaque dedicated to Miss Eleanor, showing audiences how something beautiful could emerge from even the ugliest moments. "Miss Eleanor taught me compassion without saying a word," Chloe said during one speech. "Even in death, she reminds us to be better, to do better." Tyler struggled more openly with the aftermath of the film. Though he hoped revisiting the past would bring closure, it instead reopened wounds he thought had healed. He began attending therapy regularly, encouraged by friends and family who saw the toll it was taking on him. Slowly, he started volunteering at addiction recovery centers, sharing his story with others battling their own demons. "You can't outrun your mistakes," he admitted in one session, "but you can choose how you carry them." Madison remained enigmatic, refusing further interviews despite public curiosity about her life. Rumors swirled that she had indeed joined a convent, dedicating herself to prayer and service, but nothing was confirmed. Those close to her claimed she found peace in solitude, channeling her grief into quiet acts of kindness. Occasionally, locals reported seeing her tending to the memorial garden, planting new flowers or tidying up fallen leaves. Whether intentional or not, these small gestures kept Miss Eleanor's memory alive in ways words never could. Back in Willow Creek, the documentary reignited discussions about race and privilege, prompting residents to examine how far they'd come and how much farther they still needed to go. Statues honoring Confederate figures were replaced with monuments celebrating unity, diversity workshops expanded to neighboring towns, and annual vigils were held in Miss Eleanor's honor. The tragedy had forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths, and while progress wasn't perfect, it was undeniable. For many, the most poignant takeaway from the documentary was the idea that redemption isn't always external, it's deeply personal. Some believed Jake and Tyler deserved little sympathy, arguing their actions were too cruel to forgive. Others saw Chloe's efforts as proof that people can grow beyond their worst decisions, and Madison's silence spoke volumes about the complexity of guilt and grace. Ultimately, Beneath the Surface challenged viewers to reflect on their own lives, the choices they make, the prejudices they hold, and the legacies they leave behind. It reminded everyone that while the past cannot be changed, its lessons can shape the future. As the years rolled on, Miss Eleanor Hayes' name continued to echo through Willow Creek, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a beacon of resilience. Her story endured, teaching generations that even in the darkest moments, there is light waiting to break through, if only we have the courage to seek it. And for the 4 individuals whose reckless actions altered countless lives, her legacy stood as a constant reminder. The choices we make define us, but they don't have to destroy us forever.